Bob Messerschmidt. Thank you for joining me on the Uncommon Living podcast.
Good to see you, Professor Seager. Very nice to see you.
I should probably thank Dr. Robert Lufkin for introducing us. I was reaching out to him because I really admire his book, Lies I Taught in Medical School. And it gives us a good arc of the decades of misconceptions that are now being overturned. People can get their own data on their own bodies in ways that they've never been able to before. When my son got a continuous glucose monitor, as an example, it must have been 15 years ago that we could better track his insulin in real time because he's type 1 diabetic. And the data that I was getting from him was so much more reliable than whatever advice I was going to get from the American Diabetes Association or the dietitian or the endocrinologist. That
Yeah,
misconceptions are now being overturned by people who are capable of managing their own health with their own data. And I got really
yeah,
interested in your invention because it's not continuous glucose monitoring. It's not continuous ketone monitoring. You've invented a machine that allows people to monitor a marker of inflammation at home. And I wanted to ask you, why would anybody want to do that, Bob?
yeah, yeah. So a lot of people do, and thank you for the great setup there. The so you talk about people measuring things themselves episodically, and that's really what it's all about for me. My universe is looking for technologies, and it has been for a decade or so. My career is longer than that, but the most recent decade is things that I'm about to describe. I've become a believer that episodically measured blood information is really a way that's going to help people get healthier. And it's a little bit still today at odds with the way medicine is practiced. And a lot of the way medicine is practiced is there's a strong sort of overriding function of cost reduction, which there should be, of course. But it's really difficult to get blood from a medical loop. It's really tough to get blood information frequently, and so I looked at the sorts of things that you're talking about. I looked at glucometers. I looked at ketone meters. I looked at how they are being increasingly useful to people to track things themselves. And we can get into all the reasons why I think tracking, and you and I have talked about this previously. Tracking is important because it can create an engagement loop. And if you don't have frequent data and relatively immediate data, you're not really, from a behavioral perspective, you're not really able to create that engagement loop. So why inflammation? Well, it turns out it was something that didn't exist. There was no way to get this frequent, episodic, instant result information about inflammation. That's a mouthful. And it was becoming clear as I continued to read the literature as a layman that inflammation was increasingly being seen as underpinning really all chronic disease and even some acute disease. So when you think about any chronic condition, whether it's metabolic or cardiovascular, there seems to be an underlying inflammatory process. So I was looking for a broad marker of systemic inflammation that I could, because I'm a hardware device, that I could build a device around. It would be based on blood because that's where the information is. And it'd be, a really simple, painless, seamless process to get a tiny amount of blood and give you a number, a trackable number that was related to your inflammation status. I think that is going to be equally important glucose level is obviously really important if you're type 1 diabetic. If you're type 2 diabetic or non diabetic, it's still a useful number, and ketones are a useful number. I think inflammation, the way we're measuring it, is going to become an even more important number in those segments of the population. Anybody who's interested in, chronic wellness, reducing the probability of chronic conditions, and through that process, improving their chances of longevity.
Okay, so Let me summarize. The way it works now, you go to your general practitioner and they say, well, we should get a blood workup. And so they draw several vials of blood, or they write you an order and you go to LabCorp, you go to Sonora Quest in my neighborhood anyway, and they have a phlebotomist draw lots of blood. They send the blood away to a centralized lab somewhere where they process tens of thousands of samples. They capture the economy of scale and they reduce the cost. And then, I don't know, 5 or 6 days later, I'll get an email or my doctor will send me a report saying what my C reactive protein is. And I'll look at that and they'll say, oh, we should keep an eye on this. Let's test again in 6 months.
That's right. That's right.
I
So
think what
that's
you're
good.
saying
That's
is that doesn't motivate any sort of lifestyle or behavioral change.
no, it supports the medical loop, right? So if there are going to be medical interventions, it supports that. So if your doctor is going to use that data to prescribe a therapeutic, it supports that loop. That's really what it's meant for. And you don't see your doctor very frequently, or at least I don't.
Bob, I never see my I don't even have a doctor anymore.
Yeah,
I'm trying to avoid doctors. And I do get my blood drawn, but I do it every 6 months. I got to
yeah,
go to
exactly.
the lab and that kind of thing. And I'm very happy with my blood markers. Triglycerides to HDL are around zero point 0.6, which is indicative of insulin sensitivity. I track my HbA1c. I learned that from my son's type 1 diabetes
Good, good
diagnosis and
marker.
very
Yeah,
happy. Yep, like 5.0, 5.1, that kind of thing. Um,
exactly. Yeah,
I'm not in the least bit concerned about my high LDL levels. A lot of people who use the ketogenic diet, and I go in and out, will have elevated LDL, but it's not associated with increased risk of heart disease until the LDL becomes oxidized or glycated. So I don't worry about that at all. But what I can't do is track inflammation markers on a day to day basis as someone who would use a urine test to track
yeah,
their
that's right.
ketones or something.
Exactly.
Okay. Then if
Well,
I
so
understand it,
and let me just interject that each of these markers has their own cadence. So when you're measuring glucose yourself, glucose changes intraday, and it changes, as the medical word is, postprandially, which means post meal. So after you eat something, your glucose changes rapidly. It's supposed to. And the so tracking those changes intraday with a very frequent feedback loop is important. And ketones, maybe on a day-to-day basis. Inflammation doesn't change quite that rapidly. So systemic inflammation, the markers of it that are in your blood, they all have different half times. Don't get me wrong, but none of them are super quick. So when you want to create an inflammation feedback loop, you may do it day to day, but you probably would be okay doing it week to week. Sorry, that's a bit of a I went down a bit of a rabbit hole there with a nuance of the inflammation measurement. but but every 6 months is not going to cut it, because getting back to your point, climbing out of the rabbit hole now. The Doing it every 6 months is going to be fine for prescribing a therapeutic, and your doctor waves and see you again. But for creating a lifestyle, a loop that you can engage in yourself, you need more immediate data. Yeah,
so targeting inflammation is appropriate because it's associated with chronic illness. Medicine has no cure for chronic illness. They have drugs that might help you manage your labs or manage your symptoms, but they have no cures. Statins will not cure heart disease. ACE
that's right.
inhibitors will not cure high blood pressure. Even Viagra and these PDE5 inhibitors are not going to cure erectile dysfunction. They might move a blood marker on a lab report and they might manage a symptom, but there are no cures. Increasingly, people are recognizing that these chronic illnesses are the result of what we call lifestyle,
Yeah.
behavioral choices. And the
Yeah.
physician will say, well, you should eat less and you should exercise more. I'll see you in 6 months. I think that there's a big problem in wellness. People don't trust the government institutions anymore. They they might like their physician, but they know that insulin is not going to fix their type 2 diabetes. And so they turn to health influencers and social media and they say, well, can I believe David Sinclair? Can I believe Paul Saladino? Can I believe
Yeah.
Peter? Should I get my advice from Ben Greenfield? It is an enormous burden for anyone to sort through all the different claims that they might hear on social media. But your continuous glucose monitor doesn't lie. And I think
Exactly. Yeah.
you're doing them is you've got this at home invention that allows people to strip away all the advice that they heard on the Mel Robbins podcast and
Yeah.
decide if thing that they're doing. It could be a change in diet, a change in exercise, a change in sleep. It could be red light therapy or ice baths or hyperbaric or something else that they've been incorporating into their life is actually working for them
Yeah.
at a
Yeah.
tempo that they can respond and adjust, if I'm understanding this correctly.
That's exactly right. Those are all of the influencers that you're mentioning, though they provide the ideas, right? And you can, just like, 20 years ago, we would read a magazine, a health focused magazine. We might have read Prevention magazine, right? My dad did. And it might, talk about the benefits of vitamin E or lecithin or whatever, low carb diets, whatever it is, whatever the idea is, you're not going to know unless you have that data of how things are working for you. And you need the right signals. So, and you need it right away, right? Because you want to be able to adjust that loop. That's just the behavioral psychology aspect of it, which, when I was learning at Apple, when I was involved in Apple Health and had been having conversations with Steve Jobs about such things, and he understood this behavioral loop and this engagement loop better than anyone I've met before or since. And it's real. The way you can't just tell somebody to change their habits or their lifestyle or eat better. Everybody is doing things that are deleterious to their health, and it's really powerful to understand what those things are that are either helping you or hurting you, and seeing that in black and white in the data. So I've always been a data guy, always been science based, and always been a hardware guy. And so that's what I've built. I've built a hardware device to give you this rapid feedback about inflammation.
How does it work?
Glad you asked. I have a device here. It's a really simple hardware device. Might look, nicely designed. It's really two parts. There's this device plugs into a USB port, and it's got a Wi-Fi chip in it. So it's you set this up in your home, and you have to do a little onboarding process to tell it your Wi-Fi router in your home, and then it's in communication with our sending the data to us for processing. And then these are little blood tubes. So you might see that there's a little bit of blood in there. And
Some people are listening in their car. And so I'm going to
right,
describe
right,
them a little
sure.
better. You held up a white plastic box about the size of a modem. And then it comes with what reminds me of something like an EpiPen, about that size, but it's hard to see it in detail. This is how you are going to extract the blood from your fingertip so that the machine can read it.
Yeah, I'll describe it verbally so I easier for people who aren't on a camera. It's very analogous to a glucose test strip or a ketone test strip. So you basically are going to take a lancet, which we provide, and do a little lancet on your fingertip, draw a drop of blood. And the test tube that I was talking about, you say is about the size of an EpiPen. It's basically a capillary tube. So you uncap it, and then hold this drop of blood from your finger up to it, and it capillaries the blood up into the tube. So it's basically a way of getting a long, thin container of blood, and it's one drop. It's not very much blood at all. It's not like if anybody's done, mail in dried blood spot tests or something like that that require drip, 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 drip. This is not like that. This is a really tiny, tiny drop of blood. Once you have that, it goes into the modem sized device. And inside the device, there's some optics. And the optics are reading that tube, and they're looking for something called the erythrocyte sedimentation rate, or ESR. And basically what that is it was discovered something like 120 years ago that people would have different rates of the speed at which the red cells would separate from a whole blood sample. And the red cells would do two things. They would first clump together. They would create this rouleau stage, and that makes the red cells heavier. And then, depending on how much they clump together, they would fall and separate from the plasma. You can measure that rate. So that's what our optics are doing. They're measuring that rate and producing something called the ESR, the erythrocyte sedimentation rate. It turns out the more the red cells, the more inflammation you have, the more inflammatory proteins that you have in your blood, the stickier your red cells become. So, you basically don't want sticky red cells because they're going to clog things up, right? So basically, the more clumping you have, the bigger these clumps get, therefore the heavier they are and the more rapidly they fall out of solution. So a higher SED rate, a higher erythrocyte sedimentation rate is related to inflammation. Strongly correlated. It's one of the most researched lab biomarkers. It's, I think, still the 12th most requested laboratory blood test, although it used to be higher. And we can go into the reasons why it's not number one or number two. It's a very frequently ordered medical test, and strongly correlated with all-cause morbidity and mortality due to chronic inflammation.
All right, I'm going to summarize this from my perspective as an environmental engineer.
Okay.
When I was in graduate school, one of the things that I had to learn about was the zeta potential. In
Oh,
order
yeah.
to clean water, we would add something called alum, aluminum sulfate. Now, I'm not a big fan of aluminum in drinking water, but this is how drinking water is treated in all of our municipalities across the United States. You add this alum, and what it does is compress the charge layer around these very fine suspended particles. So they may be particles of clay or maybe silt. When that charge layer compresses, it allows the particles to come closer together until they agglomerate. The zeta potential of the water is a measure of how compressed that charge layer is. When the particles compress the charge layer and they agglomerate, they become more dense and they then precipitate out, or they're easier to filter. So I learned this is how we're going to clean drinking water. Well, later on, I discovered that our blood also has a zeta potential, that the
Right.
red blood cells also have a charge layer. And you can manipulate the zeta potential of the blood to either agglomerate the red blood cells, in which will increase the viscosity of the blood, this rouleau syndrome, in which several red blood cells are all agglomerated together. It will increase viscosity and it will decrease perfusion through capillaries, because many of these tiny little blood vessels are even smaller than a single red blood cell. They have to
Yeah. Yeah.
expand to allow the red blood cells through. When you agglomerate them, they can no longer fit in the capillaries. And is it any wonder that we want lower blood viscosity? We want less agglomerated blood so we can get better perfusion through our capillaries. I had no idea that there was this measure ESR that is analogous to what we were measuring with the particle collision and agglomeration rate using a laser or some particle size analyzer in
There
our
you go.
lab, 30 years ago.
Right.
And it seemed
Yeah.
really clever.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah. It's you didn't think your environmental engineering background was going to be useful in blood chemistry, but yeah, totally the same concept. When I think about it, when I think about what people were doing in medical research 100 years ago, I don't have to go back to Roman times, So I know that's kind of a meme on social media right now, but even just go back 100 years. The way to think about this problem back then was, well, what can I measure? Here's something that I can see happening in something. In this case, blood, and I can see that this separation effect is happening. And first of all, can I measure it repeatably? And that's the first question. So now I have a measurement. Now the second question is that data useful for anything, right? Does it correlate with any outcomes? So that's always the question in medicine. I can measure a lot of things completely non-invasively using sensors that are in wearables. People always want to do more and more with those non-invasive measures, but for the most part, they're not turning out to be terribly useful. I mean, they're useful to a level, but they don't. You need something that strongly correlates with outcomes if you're going to be able to use it as a feedback loop for becoming healthier, right? So what is the importance of galvanic skin response, or what is the importance of heart rate variability? So there's there's some good evidence, but compare that to something like blood pressure. So blood pressure was also invented 100 years ago, 120 years ago, as a measurement. And then it was put to the test, well, many times, but most famously in the Framingham Heart Study in the 70s. So it was a huge population study, tens of thousands of people in Framingham, Massachusetts. And they were followed for 20, 30, 40 years. And, they were studied, and people understood when they had ultimate bad outcome, right? When they died, or when they had morbidities. So morbidity and mortality. And it was through that process of doing a very rigorous research study, Framingham study, measuring blood pressure in a very careful manner, that it was discovered that someone's blood pressure is highly causal. So it's a number that is, in terms of being able to predict outcomes, it has to be causal, and it is. And so, that's why we today are, very, we like that as a marker. Um, ESR has the same kind of data behind it. It is a independent prognostic indicator of morbidity and mortality in the same kind of level as is blood pressure. So when I was learning all this, I realized, yeah, this is totally something that I want to bring to consumers. Sort of channeling Steve Jobs here. Bringing this directly to consumers and allowing them to create feedback loops based upon it.
I'm so glad you brought up the Framingham study because it's very difficult to do longevity studies on human beings. We live so goddamn long. Like Nick Norwitz might go on Twitter and say, I ate nothing but 9 cans of sardines for a month, and this is what happened. And it tells you nothing about his mortality.
That's
So
right.
the claims that we see online, and Norwitz isn't saying sardines are going to help you live longer, but rapamycin had a moment. People were taking metformin thinking that that was going to extend their lives. And there's no way to do a study in a human being without this decadal longitudinal time frame.
Yeah.
Blood pressure, those findings were one of the ones that got people scared because blood pressure is actually a subclinical marker with some meaning. You might not feel symptomatic, but when we measure chronic hypertension, we know from the Framingham study how dangerous that is to human longevity. The dang thing about that is the medical establishment, we're talking about the allopathic centralized medicine, can leverage the fear that people have of an asymptomatic or I use the word subclinical, that's probably not the right word, but an asymptomatic chronic illness that is going to eventually, bite them in the butt by being correlated with a risk of heart disease or some other catastrophic end to their life. And the blood pressure guidelines have been getting stricter and stricter in order to encourage people to go on things like ACE inhibitors. In other words, the Framingham study got it right, but the therapies were wrong. It
You're
led
right.
to fear mongering about sodium and whatever it is. It didn't get people to a place where they learned what they could do about their blood
There's
pressure.
there, there's famously a whole class of drugs that was developed that are still widely prescribed today called beta blockers.
Right.
And beta blockers have a tremendous impact on blood pressure. They lower blood pressure. And then in the longitudinal studies, though, they found that people were still dropping dead when they were on beta blockers, even though they had lowered blood pressure.
It's a
So
classic
yeah,
case of treating a lab rather than treating a human being. We've moved your lab marker, but we don't really know what that's going to mean.
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Well,
So that's the best you could do, as you point out. Humans, I mean, in some ways, um, the fact that if you're going to do experiments on yourself, which I'm all in favor of,
me too.
you have to have quick feedback. So you have to have surrogate markers. You can't wait until you die to see how not to die.
Well, those sardines didn't work out.
That's right. Let's have a do over.
Well, it brings up Steve Jobs. He had ideas about pancreatic cancer. He resisted the surgery that was recommended. And I don't know if nobody knows whether the surgery would have saved his life, but he had ideas like, I'm going to go on a fruit diet or I'm going to go on a pescatarian diet or something like that. He didn't have the feedback. He didn't have the routine, the fast tempo feedback of what was happening in his blood markers at the time. Why aren't the wearables? It's been, 15 years since Jobs died. Why aren't the wearables doing the job?
The we touched on it briefly, but just to, let me expound or pontificate a little bit further. If you think about where medicine, the field of medicine, is getting its information, all the really good information, blood pressure is kind of an anomaly because it is completely non-invasive. It's one of the few exceptions to what I'm about to say, but almost all medically relevant data is coming from blood. 70 or 80% of all clinical decisions are based on blood labs. And so that's the reason why wearables are not really cutting the mustard, is because they're not measuring the right thing. They're measuring things that are too low level to be able to provide the feedback that you need, even as a surrogate marker. They're too blunt and they're too smooth, if you will. You think about, a lot of us have Apple Watches and iPhones, and we measure tracks and steps, and we measure heart rate and heart rate variability, and we look at our graphs. And they are very gently moving slopes, right? They don't. There's not a lot of dynamic range to those measurements. So put it in double E terms, there's not a lot of sensitivity and there's not a lot of dynamic range. So it's all about choosing the right data. I came to believe, after I left Apple, I came to believe that that information was going to be in blood. And that's the harsh reality. You do need a little bit of blood. You don't need much, but you do need a little bit of blood to get this information. And we knew that. We knew that in the 70s with glucometers and ketone meters and so forth.
So if we're talking about measuring the right things, why is ESR the right thing instead of C reactive protein?
Well, they're both right. They're both good markers. It comes back to that information feedback loop. CRP is it's a chemical assay. So in order to measure the level of CRP in your blood, which exists in nanomolar quantities in your blood. It's a tiny, tiny little signal in your blood sample. You need a fairly complex piece of instrumentation. You need a clinical chemistry analyzer. Those cost about a $500,000, and they sit in. They're made by people like Abbott and Siemens, and they sit in central or regional research reference laboratories. So they're incredibly sensitive, and you can get CRP data from those. There's not currently a way, and you can collect your sample at home and send it off to a lab too. So that's how some people have tried to simplify that loop. But it's going to be, I want to build a lab in the home because I want to be able to not have to wait the week or 2 weeks that it takes to get the data back if you mail in your sample with a dry blood test. Because I think that's the only way to close the loop. I think that's the only way to create this engagement loop. CRP is a it's a very scarce thing in blood, and it's only reflecting one inflammatory protein. So CRP is one protein. It's produced in the liver. It's a very good protein. It can tell you a lot about inflammation, but and so I thought about that, and thought about, could I build an instrument based on measuring CRP in the home? Um, and then I happened upon ESR. ESR was how inflammation was measured. You know, in the very first NHANES data set, ESR is measured. So it was the standard of care for inflammation for many, many years. And it just turned out, from an optics and hardware perspective, it was easier for me to build an instrumentation based on ESR. So now, is ESR a good marker? So if you go to the literature, you find that, yeah, absolutely. It's a really great marker. In fact, it reflects more inflammatory pathways and different inflammatory proteins than any other marker. So instead of just CRP, it is reflective of CRP levels, but it's also reflective of fibrinogen levels, and it's also reflective of various cytokine levels. So it's going to see more causal, causes of inflammation than CRP is. So I've become I've come to really like ESR for its causality. It's very well studied, and its broadness, and as a thing you're going to measure frequently, to enable a consumer feedback loop. It's far and away the better marker than CRP to do that, just because you can't get the CRP number quickly.
The problem, though, with ESR is that it's a physiochemical test. That is, it measures this agglomeration, this coagulation of the red blood cells. You can't do an ESR sample on something that got shipped to a centralized lab in Las Vegas, because if you draw it and then ship it, the red blood cells
Yeah.
are all coagulating.
Yeah.
And by the time they get to the lab, there's nothing left to measure. And so
That's a
maybe
really good point. The rise of the way we do blood labs in this country, or anywhere, with regional laboratories, which, the reasons we do that are for, it's been viewed as the way to bend the cost curve on laboratory medicine costs. Um, and it's also been promulgated by the large testing companies like LabCorp or Quest. So it's a business proposition, but it's also a cost containment mechanism. This whole at-home measurement thing is another idea, a different idea, how you can enable this. So to go back to what you were saying about ESR, you're right. ESR in a universe where you have regional blood laboratories, when the blood is never measured at the point where you draw it anymore, hardly ever. It has to get sent off somewhere. It can be 8 hours. You don't really know the cold chain of the blood, over that time. It goes off to the laboratory, might have been handled properly, might not have been handled properly, and then gets measured. ESR is not terribly reliable in that mode. The blood degrades. The specification for ESR measurement back in the day, before regional laboratories existed, was the ESR was measured in the hospital lab, and the requirement was to measure it within 4 hours of blood draw. Well, that sets up perfectly for self-led, blood data, right? It's because you have the blood. It's by definition recently drawn, and you have it. So you should measure it, right? Because it's never going to give you better data than it does at that moment of blood draw.
Bob, you've done a lot of things in your life. You invented a company, you sold it to Apple, you worked for jobs. You could work on anything you wanted. Of the million things that you could do, why are you working on this at home ESR inflammation tester?
Yeah, it speaks to me, probably because of my experience, and my areas of expertise. I have always been a hardware guy, so I want to solve things that involve, and I've always been an optics and spectroscopy guy. So, are we, it's sort of like there's an expression that you probably might have heard. It's called a busman's holiday, right? So what it means is when a guy who drives the bus for a living and he wants to go on a vacation and he takes the bus.
A leisure time spent doing the same activity as one's usual occupation.
There you go. There you go. So that's me. I think about this, and I live and breathe optics and spectroscopy and hardware, and I want to apply it to things that are going to make a difference in society. That's why I went to work at Apple. Um, uh, that's why I started CORE. And I believe there is real opportunity, and I see it in the data, that there's an opportunity to give people additional years of life, or give them access to it. I'm not giving it to them. I'm giving them access to it if they choose to take it. And I believe that I've learned that the tools that I can provide can be enabling to help people live longer. I can't really think of a higher purpose than that. And of course, there are very personal reasons for that too. I'm a dad. I have a young daughter. Uh, I want to be around as much as possible. So I want longevity. This is not, you know, a rare story, but
Yeah, I
uh,
know the feeling.
but but that but that drives me.
Then tell us a little bit about Core. This is the company that you're using to market, manufacture, distribute the ESR analyzer.
Yeah. So I started Core after leaving Apple, and the idea was initially to think about what I could build that I could deploy in a home, or I don't rule out clinical settings. There are clinical applications of the things I'm developing also.
Agreed.
Eh, yeah, right. And so I came up with this focus on inflammation, and it's really just for me a passion project to be able to build these hardware devices. And we have now at Core, we launched now over a year ago, so it's been about a year that we've been selling these devices. We have we have thousands of these devices in the field. We're able to, because I have a lot of good friends from my Apple days in the hardware manufacturing space. I can build these things at consumer price points. Um, and so for a few $100s, you get this core device, and it costs around $10 a test to get the data. So I built, put a team together, built all this hardware, got it into manufacturing, and I'm now selling it. We've been selling it for about a year. We have thousands in the field. We have tens of thousands of tests, which now gives me the opportunity to look at that data in, of course, an anonymized fashion. I'm not looking at specifics of the data, but I'm looking at trends that I see in the data and what things are allowing people. this is population science, but it'll help point people towards things that they might want to try. Not saying that it's going to work for them, because we do see a lot of variance in that, whether something works for somebody and something doesn't work for somebody else. But we see examples of ketogenic lifestyles being able to lower inflammation levels. The people who are on ketogenic, lion diets, paleo diets, they generally in our patient population have lower inflammation levels. And during a process where we have data sets where people have done multiple tests and have done experiments, through, doing some lifestyle change and then looking at the results, we see things that are able to cause people to lower their inflammation. Most people, by the way, in our data set, 3/4 of the people in our data set come to us initially with inflammation levels that are not optimal.
Mhm.
They may be in a clinically normal range, by clinical standards. They may be not out of range. Your blood report might come back and say your ESR is in range, but that doesn't mean that it's optimal. That's probably a whole nother topic for another day. But only about 25% of our users are in what I would call an optimal range. Approximately 1/3 of the users who have started using COR and have been able to lower their inflammation levels through lifestyle modifications. So, we have probably the largest data set now that exists on inflammation data, that exists in science. So I feel good. I feel like we're really doing something for society.
Okay, well, tell me more about what people can do if they have the core machine and they're monitoring their inflammation. They want to know that they can manage it, that they can reduce their or improve their ESR measure, reduce their inflammation. You mentioned keto, and this makes sense to me. Have you looked at grounding?
We have, and this was one that was very surprising to me, because I
Oh,
didn't understand any sort of mechanism for why grounding should work. But in our patient population, grounding works. Um, and that's at a population level. So is it going to work for you? I don't know, but
it
try
will.
it. Yeah. Okay.
Unless you're already grounded, that is, unless you're regularly grounding your body,
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
the human body will be subject to the accumulation of static charge without electrical connection to the earth. And this is physics. This has got nothing to do with enzymes or your microbiome or anything like that. Without that electrical connection, the zeta potential of your blood changes in a way that encourages the agglomeration of the red blood cells and increases its viscosity, which is exactly the measure that you are taking when you're assessing ESR. And so I think you could run this experiment for yourself. You could do the ESR test with the core machine. You could then hop in your swimming pool, which is wonderful for grounding because, water is a good electrical
For
conductor and
sure.
it's in the ground. You could measure it again. And although you likely don't suffer from chronic inflammation, given your area of scientific and inventive interest, you will likely notice some difference between your pre and your post. And I'm
I do.
saying this because there we go. It sounds like you've run the experiment. I've got good imaging data. So this is putting a blood sample in a microscope and seeing the disaggregation of the red blood cells that result from grounding. I think
Exactly.
this is another physiological measure of how beneficial grounding is. The difficult thing is when people don't really know the difference. They feel it, but they don't attribute it to grounding.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. It's all about giving you a signal that is something that you can track. And, so you could say is how do I feel? Is that a signal? Yes, it is. But it's very blunt, right? So, this gives you, the tools from the blood are things to hopefully give you better, sharper feedback about what's going on. You're absolutely right. And I did this exactly, almost exactly the experiment that you described on myself and did lower my inflammation level. I didn't hop in a pool, but I went barefoot and I walked around in the dirt for a while and did a before after that way. And yeah, it did not take long to show up.
That's neat. You know that every Morozko ice bath is grounded, and the electrical connection is so strong that it's 30 times faster than walking barefoot in the grass. It's instantaneous. Some of the people who compare Morozko to acrylic tubs or fiberglass tubs or inflatables tell me there's something that they can't put their finger on and it feels
Very
different.
nice.
I know what
That
it
must be
is.
it. Yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Sure, because the fiberglass tub would not be grounded, not as well anyway. Um, the
What else
and you
have you
mentioned
figured?
ice baths. Ice
Yep.
baths are another thing that are evidentiary in our data. So cold
Tell me about
plunges, yeah, cold plunges will also, in our data set, they also are associated with lower inflammation levels. So
okay, there's a chain of logical inference that I'm going to make. And maybe we'll clip this and put this on Instagram or something. But here's the chain of logical inference. You have shown that cold plunging will improve, by that I mean reduce, generalized markers of inflammation, in particular ESR. We also know that chronic inflammation is associated with increased mortality or shorter lifetime. The chain of logical inference is now that an ice bath practice will extend your life by reducing your chronic inflammation, in this case, improving blood flow. This is something that I've suspected for a long time.
yeah,
And there's multiple mechanisms. The grounding in the Morozko is terrific for blood flow, but there's also the vasoconstriction of the cold plunges, one of the few ways to sort of exercise your smooth muscle tissue. And it makes sense, especially when it's paired with sauna in thermal contrast therapy, that you can bring your blood pressure down, improve perfusion, that is, improve the circulation throughout your body, reduce inflammation, and that would help you live a longer life. Bob, do I sound like I'm full of crap?
no, that's a totally solid, in my view, a totally solid chain of logic. And it is only so if you are sure that the thing that you're using for feedback, has a good, in very rigorous study, has really good hazard ratio, to use the nerdy statistical term. So, is your signal uh, highly correlated with the outcome that you're seeking? And here again, ESR is. And so it's something that you can measure. It changes frequently enough to be able to be used as a feedback loop. And it's highly causal for longevity, or, the inverse of that, which is morbidity and mortality.
Magnificent. Think we could, perhaps it's speculation, but I think we could get our imagination around the mechanisms by which the ESR measure, as you have described it, would be associated with improved cardiovascular function, improved perfusion, more rapid healing, for example. Why inflammation would be associated with ESR, and an improvement in ESR would indicate more than just reduced inflammation, but improved overall health is what I'm
Yeah.
imagining.
Yeah. Yeah. It's complex. Somewhat unfortunately, it's complex. But there are inflammatory processes in the body that are organ specific, and then there's these ultimately reflect as systemic inflammation. So there's a bit of a thunking layer, if you will, that there's an inflammatory process going on somewhere in your body, and then it becomes a measurable systemic inflammation. And so the mechanism of action, you're not going to be able to see where the inflammation is arising from. You're not going to be able to see in the ESR, but you're going to be able to test hypotheses. It is, purely within that chain of logic that if you are lowering systemic inflammation, you are by definition lowering organ specific inflammation somewhere, which is feeding into that systemic inflammation. So It's all directionally accurate. There are ultimately, and especially 10 years from now, there are going to be ways of measuring proteins through proteomics, which will, using very complex and very expensive laboratory instrumentation, they're going to be able to allow you to look at organ specific inflammation. There are, very rich people are able to do that today. But, we're a little bit downstream from that, which I think is okay because it's still fast enough. If we're too far downstream, it would be too slow to be useful. But
Okay, we talked about keto. We didn't talk about mechanisms by which keto would reduce inflammation. And there might be some sort of healthy subject effect. People who do keto tend to do other things that are also good for their overall health and might reduce inflammation. We talked about grounding, and here we have a direct mechanism by which grounding would reduce inflammation and improve the ESR result. We talked about ice baths, especially in combination with grounding. We understand that. What else should my audience know is available to them to manage chronic inflammation?
yeah, well, let's talk about foods and medical foods. The I'm a big fan of. I actually don't take a lot of supplements. I'm not anti-supplement, but I don't take a lot. I'm a believer that healthy foods are a really good way to get you where you want to go. Like, for example, I could take an omega supplement, a fish oil supplement, and I would see my inflammation become lower. But I could eat salmon 3 days a week, which I would enjoy doing more than taking the supplement anyway, and I would get a bigger effect. So I've been fascinated by how actionable various foods are for me and for others in the patient population. So we've had, some of my best customers have been able to impact their inflammation with just adding some very specific foods to their diet. So fatty fish, go ahead. Yeah, fatty fish is a really important one. One that is really impactful for me, and it's being used really. So tart cherries or tart cherry juice is something that I use every day. This is a not terribly well kept secret, but pretty much all major sports teams are now giving their players tart cherry juice after, at some point in the day, especially on heavy workout days, as a way to quash inflammation. Um,
Is tart tart cherry juice high in nitrites?
Good question. I don't know the answer to that. It's high in the particular anthocyanins that are anti-inflammatory. So you think about all of the fruits and berries that are in the same sort of category that are, through anthocyanins are known to be anti-inflammatory. Blueberries are really good for the same reason. I always feel really good after eating blueberries. I don't know whether you've ever noticed that for yourself, but uh, the I don't know about the nitric oxide situation with tart cherry juice. I
You
attribute
know
it.
where I'm
So
going
I
because
do, but yeah,
beetroot
go ahead.
juice will stimulate
Yes,
production of
yes.
nitric oxide and result in
Yeah,
vasodilation. And I'm like,
that's
well,
right.
I don't know. Tart cherry looks like it's the same color. Maybe it has the same ingredients. Maybe it's the same mechanism, which is probably foolhardy reasoning. But it is true that
I don't think so.
if you increase your intake of, I'm trying to remember if it's nitrate or nitrite, they often go together, that it will stimulate production of nitric oxide. Nitrogen is
Nitric
such a
oxide,
tricky
yeah.
atom. And that
Yeah.
nitric oxide will promote vasodilation and increase your circulation. So there might be something going on there.
Yeah. Yeah, there might be. There might be.
Fatty fish, tart cherry. What else you got?
So you probably, I've never done this for myself. By the way, I do not have any beet juice data in my data set that I'm aware of. I'll go through and look, but that would be one that we could study. I've often thought that it would be interesting to stand up small groups of our users into research studies. We have some customers we have a customer now who's producing a new medical food that's a combination of different ingredients that are known to be anti-inflammatory, and they produce this as a packet that you can add to water and so forth. And we're going to enroll a clinical trial on that and use the feedback from the core device. But you specifically asked me for some other examples. Another one that surprised me, like the grounding surprised me, HBOT, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, is lowers inflammation in our user population. So I don't know why I'm not doing that. There's just the workflow is a little bit more difficult, to go off to the hyperbaric chamber, but it does lower inflammation in people.
Have you got any data on ozone blood therapy or the treatment of your blood using ozone, in which they take some blood out, they ozonate it, and they put it back in your body?
I've seen it being done, but no, there's no uh, th- there's no data that I'm aware of in our data set on that, and I'm not done it myself. But I've seen it being done.
Have you got anything on red light?
Yes, yes, yeah. There is some information in our database about red light, and that is, there is an effect associated with that. I wouldn't say it's at the same level as either grounding or HBOT or even ketogenic eating styles, but there is an effect.
I'll ask you one more well, two more. A lot of these wellness spas that have opened up since the lockdowns were lifted, they combine sauna, cold plunge, red light, and compression therapy. So the other two that I know my audience is going to be curious about are compression therapy. Do you notice any improvement in ESR resulting from the use of compression sleeves?
Let's study it. I don't. It is another thing that I've seen being done at health and wellness shows
Yep.
and so forth. No, I don't have any data on that. Let's look at that.
I'm skeptical, but I want to be open to data always. And then the last one is sauna. Sauna will improve indications of cardiovascular fitness, right? This is wonderful. But will it improve the marker like ESR?
So there's an interesting thing about sauna. It's not one thing, right? It's done in a number of different ways. If you're talking about a true Swedish sauna, with wet steam, yes, that is effective. I think some of the other ways are maybe less effective. I don't want to torture my data too much, but what I think I'm seeing in the data is that these temperature modulations that we've been talking about, either high temperature modulation or low temperature modulation, they are effective when they're actually getting to the point of impacting core body temperature. So cold plunges do. And similarly, hot tubs if you use them properly, you can impact your core body temperature. And that seems to be the causal mechanism. If you are doing either if you're doing a cryogenic chamber, for example, or if you're doing a very lightweight sort of high temperature treatment, a dry sauna or something like that, that is not affecting your core temperature, then I think they're less effective. But again, I want to avoid over torturing my data.
It's a good point. When signals on blood pressure started emerging from the data, they were very strong. You don't need a massive sample size when you're getting a very strong signal.
That's
It's only the
correct.
pharmaceutical companies that, line up 100,000 Africans to test whatever their new drug is because they're looking for some very fine, you talked about hazard ratio, but this might be risk reduction ratio. When we're talking about things that really make a difference in someone's life, an N equals one experiment is the most important thing because
That's right.
nothing matters but whether it works for you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Glad to hear you say that about sauna. There's a popular misconception in the United States, and I blame Rhonda Patrick, although she's not the only one. she'll, go on Twitter, or there'll be clips on YouTube saying, well, if you sauna 45 minutes a week, your risk of death goes down to zero, or whatever the hell the exaggerated oversimplification is. The misconception is, in America, we think sauna means getting hot. But all the best studies are done in Finland. They don't just get hot. There's always a cooling period in
You're right.
every single sauna study coming out of Finland. Even the
For sure.
epidemiological studies. Finland gets cold in the winter time.
They go
And
out, run out in
people
the
there,
snow after the sauna.
that's right. And so in Finland, sauna is thermal contrast therapy. It's only in the United States that we make this erroneous inference that it must have to do with the hot box. I think the sauna, if you're only using it to get hot, it's probably beneficial, but you can't count on the results of the studies that are coming out of Finland because they're using a different method. Have we left anything out in these therapies that might help people manage inflammation?
Well, I think you're onto something there with traditional methods that have been proven culturally over centuries. I think the more we can stay hooked into those that have been proven, perhaps anecdotally originally, but by repetition, they become meaningful. We have to pay attention to the details of a process. There's no shortcuts.
Well, there's one that my audience is going to remind me about if I don't mention it, and it's UVA in the sunlight. UVA will also stimulate production of nitric oxide that will also lead to vasodilation. And my audience understands that it improves the circulation. What I don't know is whether UVA will move a marker like ESR. And so I don't know, maybe there's another N=1 experiment for you,
I
Bob,
agree.
and involve some sunbathing.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. We've taken an approach of not being really prescriptive at all in our app. So the core device, you collect data and it shows up in an app, and we give you some guidance, about what other people who are sort of like demographically similar to you, what they've done, that has been effective for lowering inflammation, but we don't set up programs and prescriptions for what you should do. We see it as a investigational tool. You can try things and you can see what's working in the true spirit of N of one types experiments. But you do need to come up with those ideas. So I encourage anyone to come to the core device with your best ideas. You simply add tags and notes in the app. And, that's enough for us to be able to say, okay, is this something that across a user population, if we have enough, instances of it in the data, to be statistically meaningful, then, we can say, okay, is this something or is this not something? And so, yeah, yeah. I think there's a lot of opportunity for for those sorts of studies. I'd love to study that one in particular.
I would too. The way that you describe you're avoiding prescription, it sounds consistent with your conservative approach. You're an FDA registered medical device. There's another way to go in business. There's no shortage of examples. You go on Twitter and you say, you drink my electrolyte, you'll never have a migraine headache again, or some oversimplified, exaggerated claim that because people do love to be told what to do. It sounds like you're avoiding that kind of sensationalism, staying squarely within the FDA guidelines. People think the FDA regulates drugs. I don't know if that's the case. They regulate marketing claims. They regulate advertising. And so you going through the process of being FDA
Yeah,
registered, it enables some things that you can do in marketing, but
yeah,
making prescriptions is the purview of a physician.
yeah, yeah. That's exactly right. I mean, it would never occur to me to do it any other way. But in my view, the only thing FDA is a lot of cost and a lot of complexity and a lot of paperwork and a lot of rigor to go through for a device for anything that you want to market to people. But the only thing worse than FDA would be no FDA. Um, you know, eh, FDA is because even with FDA, you have lots of people trying to sell you unwarranted, unproven things. Imagine how it would be in a in a no FDA world. It would be chaos.
I'm not sure. During the lockdowns, Marty Macri, who's now running the FDA, was one of the few faculty I was to who opposed the lockdowns. He took the time to write a book along the lines of Lufkin's Lies I Taught in Medical School. Macary's book was debunking or overturning popular medical misconceptions that he called dogma. And so I'm trying to remember the title. It was called Blind
Yeah,
Spots. Those things
yeah,
that
right.
people just aren't seeing. Now,
Yeah,
you think that he'd be the ideal scientist and physician to run the regulatory authority. But he's pointed out correctly that the regulatory apparatus has been captured by those commercial interests that see the regulations as a barrier to entry. In other words, tight regulations that are expensive to comply with are they inhibit innovation by preventing small companies from entering the marketplace. They're a way of
they do.
protecting the big company oligopoly. And so I've been rethinking the whole regulatory structure. Morosco is not an FDA registered device. We have all of the disclaimers on our website that are supposed to indicate that an ice bath does not diagnose or treat or cure any disease. And yet I have the articles that say, here's somebody who says they cured their cancer or their erectile dysfunction or their low testosterone by doing ice baths. Here's the clinical data. I'm just reading to you what's in the library that says what happened to this population or these cohort of research subjects when they did the ice bath.
Hmm.
And of course, if I post that on Reddit, people will attack me as being biased and self interested. They get the order of operations wrong. I don't invent the science so I can sell the ice bath. I've invented the ice bath so I can sell the science. And our marketplace is so messed up right now that
Yeah.
nobody believes me when I say these things.
Well, that's you put your finger on it. I mean, you are a good actor, right? But what would prevent is there something that needs to be in place to prevent bad actors from making claims? And how is a consumer meant to know that you're a good actor? It's
Correct.
it's really difficult to know.
It's an
And so
enormous problem.
that's really what FDA is to me. Is it's some rigor and some structure that you know I would do anyway, and you would do anyway before marketing something, but that some bad actor would not do. Right.
We have
So
seen this.
we want evidence. We want repeatability. We want accuracy. We want precision. We want all the things that science demands. And is FDA broken? Yeah, probably. Is it captured? Yeah, probably. I mean, every element of our society is captured by special interests. I mean, I have over 60 patents that I've written, authored in my career. They're mostly owned by other people. Uh,
Mhm.
but it's really difficult to as a small company to defend a patent because the intellectual property process is so expensive that if the 800-pound gorilla wants to practice your invention, there's actually very little stopping them because um, they have the deep pockets. So
You are correct.
who said money talks, and the rest of that expression.
People are confused about the value of a patent. They think, well, because the police will enforce laws about theft of your car, they think that our government will somehow enforce intellectual property laws. And that's not the case. The patent is only as good as your willingness to sue people who are infringing
That's exactly
upon
right.
your.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. So yeah, I mean. This is probably a topic for another call, but I mean, there's the very large companies created this concept of patent trolls. Basically as a way of saying, if you're a small entity, stay the hell away from patents because we're the big guys and we make the rules. So they created this concept of patent trolls. It's this idea of capture by the whoever's doing the capturing, and there are many different sources, but that's nothing new. I mean, that's
Right.
it's
Yeah.
life.
It goes back to the East India Tea Company, for goodness
It's
sake.
there.
Bob, this has been magnificent. I think the people who listen to the Uncommon Living podcast on a regular basis are going to be very glad that they've been introduced to you. I know I am. It has been terrific to get to know you and what you're
Same here.
working on. When I went on your website for the first time, I'm guilty of thinking, well, this is a Theranos scam. I'm guilty of being one of those Reddit trolls, that posts, that's all a bunch of crap. And having talked to you now for off camera and this interview, I'm convinced you're really onto something. And I want to help people learn what it is you're doing.
Yeah, I very much appreciate that, and appreciate the time on your show. We're trying to make a meaningful difference, and love the fact that you'll get it in front of your audience. So let's keep thinking about those experiments too.
Terrific. I hope we get to meet in person soon. I'm going to talk you into that ice bath.
Perfect, perfect. I'm game.
Then I'll see you soon.
Thank you.